So good afternoon and welcome to another Network 2020 briefing. Really good to have everybody here on this Monday, the 14th of December of this most incredible year 2020. So thank you all for joining us. And our topic for today is the UK and the EU after a Brexit transition ends. Now, I was just talking to Brian and the team and saying, I remember that I'm a board member of Network 2020. My name is Lisa Rhodes, so welcome to this. I remember hosting the first discussion briefing with Network 2020 in my apartment just prior to the elections, and it was a bit of a surprise. So people, this is a story that is continuing, and we look forward now to hearing what we're doing over here right now. So joining me today is Dr. Ted Bromund and Dr. Dalibor Rohac, who are both very expert in this area. But let me start out by saying that Network 2020, as I think people who have been part of this will know, is that we're an NGO, and we are an international community that bridges the gap between private sector and foreign policy worlds. We leverage entrepreneurship and establish emerging leaders to dive into innovative research and solutions that are critical to developing foreign policy challenges on that. And that's Network 2020's goal, is really to educate and bridge that gap. So on that. So with that, we bring briefings to you, and we hope that these are topics of interest that help all of us learn, as well as facilitate our economic endeavors and our entrepreneurship endeavors. So with all of that in mind, welcome. Let me introduce our two panelists and start the discussion on what has been an extraordinary journey, and hopefully this journey is coming to some kind of conclusion, and we'll get to hear from these two experts who are doing it. So first, let me introduce Dr. Ted Bromund. Ted right now is a senior research fellow at the Heritage Foundation, Margaret Thatcher Center for Freedom. He also has studies and writes on Anglo-American relations, US and British reactions with Europe, and the European Union, America's leadership role, and the world and international organizations and territories. He served for 9 years as an associate director of the International Security Studies at Yale. He's received numerous awards and a doctorate in history, a master's degree in history from Yale, and a Bachelor of Arts degree from Iowa's Sewanee College. He's recognized as a Second Amendment Foundation and the Scholar of the Year, and he's received the Foundation's Global Leadership Award. So welcome, Ted. And Dr. Dalibor Rohac. And Dr. Rohac is a resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute, where he studies political economy in the European Union, one of my favorite subjects, a research associate at the Winifred Martin Center for European Studies in Brussels, author of In Defense of Globalism, and also Towards an Imperfect Union, a conservative case of the EU, included in Foreign Affairs magazine, and some of the best book of 2016. He's written about European affairs for the Washington Post, the New York Times, the FT, the Wall Street Journal, Foreign Affairs, and many other outlets, and has appeared on television and radio, the BBC, Bloomberg Television, Fox, and Fox Business. He holds a PhD in political economy from the King's College in London and economics from Oxford University. So I think, as we can see, these gentlemen are experts in this area and have been delving into this subject matter. So Ted and Dalibor, thank you very much, and welcome to this discussion. Really appreciate you being here. So why don't we kick this off? And I want to actually start off with a question, but if you could, both of you, take some time and give your views as to this incredible period of time. The beginning of this year, the end of January, marked the period of transition phase where the UK officially left the EU. And now we're in this phase that is supposed to end December 31st of this year, to have some kind of final resolution for this. And could you give our audience, each of you, a briefing of what you think is the overview of the current situation and how negotiations are going right now? So Dalibor, why don't I have you start with that question, and feel free to add comments in as a prompt to give your views here.
Well, Lisa, thank you, first of all, for this this opportunity and for the introduction. It's a real pleasure to be with all of you today, although I would have preferred to do this in person, naturally, but such are the times we are living in. So what I would like to do is to perhaps step back a little bit and to try to frame the conversation that we are going to have in terms of three broad observations I'd like to make, which I think are useful for understanding where the UK and the EU are at the moment. The first point I'd like to make is that the referendum that took place in 2016, in which British voters voted for leaving the European Union, created a mandate for Brexit, but it did not create a mandate for any Brexit in particular. And that's very understandable. Different people supported the cause of the UK's leaving the EU for different reasons. For some people, it was about immigration. For other people, it was about sovereignty and democracy. For other people, it was about suffocating European bureaucracy. And in fact, before the referendum, there was very little in terms of a coherent alternative articulated by the Leave campaign. And you can say that's fair, right? The alternative to membership is non-membership, and that can mean different things to different people. But it is also the case that basically all countries in the EU's vicinity, in Europe or in that broad neighborhood, have some sort of arrangements in place with the European Union, facilitating political dialogue, facilitating trade, and many other questions. And there is a whole spectrum of different arrangements that can exist. So what happened with the referendum was that there was a mandate to leave, but it left this question of what does it look after we are gone without an answer. And I would also argue that the aftermath of the referendum, the political dynamics in the UK, especially within the Conservative Party, created a push for ever more extreme versions of Brexit sort of gaining dominance. Before the referendum, you could see figures like Dan Hannan, very cerebral leaver, assuring voters that Brexit would really have no economic downside, that the UK would preserve its access to the single market. And there was also in some quarters this notion that the EU would just sort of cave into all of British demands, particularly because of the importance of German export industry and so forth. Now, what happened after the referendum was that gradually many of these options that were initially entertained were ruled out. A full membership in the single market of the sort exercised by Norway or Switzerland was ruled out on the grounds that would go hand in hand with free movement of labor, something that was a red line for many of the Brexiteers. Customs union was likewise ruled out because that would constrain in various ways the ability of the UK to strike its own trade agreements in the future. And eventually, this dynamic brought down Theresa May's government. Eventually, thanks to Boris Johnson's brinkmanship, a withdrawal agreement was agreed on and adopted in the last minute, which basically meant the continuation of many of the features of UK's membership beyond the withdrawal date. And that withdrawal agreement, the transitory period, is ending at the end of this month, and it still remains quite unclear what is coming next. My second point is that necessarily Brexit involves trade-offs, and those trade-offs are not particularly pleasant for people who pushed for the UK to leave to confront. The EU, is a very odd, complicated entity, but one of the things that it is a club of countries that have agreed to pursue deep economic integration in a way that markets are brought closely together by agreeing on common rules. I mean, the EU is far more institutionalized and goes really far deeper than either NAFTA or ASEAN or various other sort of forms of regional economic integration that we know from around the world. It's probably the sort of deepest form of market integration outside of the context of actual countries where you have a single market, like in the United States. And today, exporting from the UK to the rest of the EU or to the EU is hardly more complicated than exporting from Virginia to Maryland, and the volume of trade which exists, the volume of merchandise and also services that sort of cross the border every day is massive. You have something around 10,000 trucks going through the port of Dover every day with minimal hindrance, with minimal red tape to go through. And as a result, over the 40 years that the UK was member of the EU, you had complicated value chains develop, spanning across the border, that simply couldn't exist if it weren't for this hindrance-free access or sort of connection between the UK and the EU. And the dilemma, the basic dilemma of Brexit is that it's very hard to reconcile the notion of retaking control and potentially reneging on many of the common rules that exist within the EU with the currently existing degree of economic integration. And Boris Johnson famously said that his policy was pro having the cake and pro eating it, but it is very unlikely that the EU would agree to an arrangement of that sort. I mean, it would essentially mean giving a very different treatment to the UK than to all other non-members. And as I said, there are different modes on which we can sort of settle this question. Norway and Switzerland, for example, are essentially rule takers, parts of the single market, and there is very little in terms of economic barriers between them and the EU. Other countries may have tariff-free access in some, if not most, areas of trade, but their exports, services, etc., would still face regulatory barriers. And the sticking point actually that is related to this, which is probably the most important obstacle to the agreement between the EU and the UK is really this sort of prospect for potential divergence in rules and regulations, which is why the EU is insisting so much on this notion of a level playing field. So the EU for itself, they want to reserve the right to essentially reintroduce trade barriers if there is divergence in rules, and if the EU feels for whatever reasons that the UK is undercutting the EU's rules. And I'm not necessarily as a free marketeer thrilled by that, right? Sometimes undercutting the existing rules might be a useful tool if you want to curb over-regulation in big government-run economies. But it is very easy to see where the EU is coming from, and it's very easy to see why it actually have quite a lot of leverage in this process. My final point is very simple, namely that the deal is indeed in everybody's interest, right? So the negotiations right now seem stuck. Yesterday was one of these arbitrary deadlines set for the negotiations to be completed, but the transition period ends at the end of December. My expectation is that some agreement will be reached, but the reason why it's so hard to reach one is precisely because it's not very politically appealing to sort of confront these trade-offs. And in the past, I think it has always been the case that you needed a hard deadline and the prospect of a disruption caused by the UK crashing out that actually concentrated people's minds and forced them to arrive at an agreement. Again, I'll say this: there is no country in the EU's immediate neighborhood that will have a no-deal arrangement with the bloc. I don't think that's sustainable. And you can have a no-deal arrangement with the EU if you're Australia, right? And your mutual trade and economic interactions are minimal. But 7 out of 10 UK's export destinations are in the EU. 40% of British exports go to the bloc. A lot of it are in the area of services, which are sensitive not just to tariffs, but also to economic regulation and differences in economic regulation. So these incentives to strike an agreement are there. I'm not sure if it's technically feasible to arrive at a fully fledged trade agreement by the end of the transitory period. I don't think that's likely. What we'll see more likely is some decision to extend the existing existing arrangements in some shape or form. But there is also, I have to say, a risk of miscalculation especially on the British side, because this is an asymmetric problem for the UK. Really, apart from COVID, this is the #1 priority. For the EU, not so much, and so I think we can expect some concessions on the EU side, but the sort of idea that the bloc is going to, at the last minute, twist itself into a pretzel to make the sort of hardcore Brexiteers happy is to me quite fanciful. So I'll stop here and
okay, good. Wow, that's a lot. Dalibor, thank you very much for those introductions. So Ted, we'd like to offer you the same question and get your thoughts on this, because I think Dalibor, you're saying quite a bit about these things. I think the unanticipation of what that Brexit could be, what that extreme Brexit could be, and the asymmetry of the interest on it. Those are two interesting points. So Ted, over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Lisa. Really a pleasure to be back with Network 2020. I talked to you only about 11 months or so ago. It seems more like about 11 years when we gathered in a very pleasant New York living room to talk about Brexit the last time. Real pleasure also to be with my friend Dalibor, with whom I agree and disagree about a great many things. I really actually agreed with almost all of Dalibor's introductory remarks. So I'm going to phrase my opening comments, make them a little bit shorter, and just make a couple of points about sort of the overall situation and then the process of the negotiations. I want to start off by, I think, maybe contradicting Dalibor just a little bit. I would argue that the significance of Brexit in economic terms has always been exaggerated, whether you're pro-Brexit or anti-Brexit. From my point of view, being a member of the EU is compatible with being a highly productive and successful economy like Germany, or being a near economic basket case like Greece. It therefore seems fairly obvious to me that EU membership is not the be-all and end-all, or even the primary, or even the major determinant of whether or not you're economically successful. At the end of the day, national policies, and then things that I would broadly sum up as the character of the people, which encompasses a huge range of social, economic, cultural, educational, and other factors, are more important for national prosperity than EU membership. What, for example, will have the greatest long-term effect on the economic health of Britain or Europe? Brexit, on the one hand, on the other. What will have the greatest long-term effect? Brexit, or all of the national debt that countries across Europe have piled up in their effort to fight the economic effects of COVID? The answer to me seems fairly obvious. Brexit is an economic factor, but it's easy to exaggerate its significance. Now, having said that, I want to turn specifically to the UK EU negotiations. The goal of these negotiations is to arrive at a comprehensive FTA, a CFTA as it's sometimes abbreviated. Both the UK in mid-May and the EU in mid-March have published their negotiating objectives for this CFTA. The negotiations themselves began at the end of March, and you'll immediately notice something. The EU published its negotiating objectives about 2 weeks before negotiations began. The UK didn't get its negotiating objectives out until about 2 months after negotiations began. And this points to one of the problems, though far from the only problems, that has bedeviled these negotiations. It's all very well and good to decide that you want an FTA, but there are lots of kinds of FTAs out there in the world. The EU, for example, has an FTA agreement with Canada, which, as FTAs go, is pretty deep and quite comprehensive. The EU is also negotiating an FTA with Australia. That looks like it's going to be a much thinner FTA. So just saying that you want a free trade area, and it took the British a long time, as Dalibor sort of hinted, even to arrive at the idea of an FTA in the first place. Even saying you want an FTA doesn't really get you very far down the road of deciding what precisely it is that you want. So internal political wrangles over the desired outcome in the UK were a serious barrier to getting these negotiations going. I think COVID has helped the negotiations in some respects, but it's probably also hurt them in other ways. So COVID is a complicating factor and probably on the whole a delaying factor. Uh, Another problem has been, I don't think that just as the UK had trouble deciding what it wanted, I don't think that the EU has really ever grasped what the UK's position actually is. If you want to get a sense of the British position, the most important thing you should read is the speech made by David Frost, the UK's chief negotiator in Brussels, which he made on February 17th. This is a very, very easy speech to read. David's a wonderful speaker, and it wouldn't take you more than 10 or 15 minutes to read through. I wanted to read just one short quotation from David's speech that I think sort of summarizes the British position. David Frost said this, quote, "We bring to the negotiations not some clever tactical positioning, but the fundamentals of what it means to be an independent country. It is central to our vision that we must have the ability to set laws that suit us, to claim the right that every other non-EU country in the world has." Well, we could sort of talk and sort of break that idea down, but Dalibor has already pointed out that most of the countries around the EU have some sort of fairly close rule-taking integration with the European Union. That's not compatible with what David Frost said in his speech. So the EU has one vision for its near abroad. The UK had quite another. And I think there's been a lot of mutual incomprehension about the fundamental difficulty, I was almost going to say incompatibility, of these two points of view. I would say, in short, that what it comes down to is that it took the British a long time to come to their point of view, and the EU, in turn, had gotten used to dealing with people like Theresa May, who collapsed on virtually everything, as most British prime ministers have done in matters European since the early 1970s. And so, therefore, you had sort of a mutual incomprehension and failure to grasp where the other side was coming, which combined with the fact that negotiating a comprehensive FTA in 8 months is an almost insanely ambitious schedule. FTAs like this normally take multiple years to negotiate. You combine all of those things together and you put COVID on top of it, and it was almost guaranteed to come down to the wire and potentially not to get done at all. And that's really where we are now.
Very interesting. So you're saying that COVID is a complication, and what we're hearing here is that Brexit is just one element of a trade and a financial position for a company, but not the reason whether a country is successful or not. So Ted, you're raising issues of nation state versus participation in a block of countries, that there are pros and cons to each part of those things. So that's an interesting point that we want to do. I think one of the key questions or the highlights here is that we're talking about trade quite a bit, and it's always an economic position. But could we get into something before we go a little bit further down the trade rabbit hole? When you talk about understanding, it looks like that the EU or the UK has had a position with Northern Ireland. Could both of you give a little bit of a perspective on what the issue was and how they were able to resolve it, and really why this was always such a complicating factor for these negotiations? So Ted, why don't we start with you this time on that question?
Yeah, I think when I spoke to Network 2020 last time back in January, I made the argument then that the Irish situation would ultimately be resolved, and that has proven, I'm pleased to say, to be correct. Um, the core of the difficulty is that it's complicated enough to arrive at a trade agreement between the UK proper and the EU proper, which has a boundary between them that isn't a land boundary, sea and air. The only place where EU Irish territory directly touches UK territory is Ireland, Northern Ireland. So you've got first the problem of a land border. Then second, you have the extraordinarily long and fraught history of the relationship between Ireland, Northern Ireland, and the remainder of the United Kingdom, which is sort of summed up in the Good Friday Agreement that culminated the peace process in Northern Ireland. And I, I think the Good Friday Agreement is sometimes slightly mischaracterized or maybe misunderstood in the United States and perhaps in the UK as well. The essence of the Good Friday Agreement was that it recognized that they were not two communities in this sort of complicated area that had to be made happy. There were three communities that had to be satisfied. There were the nationalists in Ireland proper, there are the nationalists in Northern Ireland, and there are the unionists in Northern Ireland, who are actually the majority. The Good Friday Agreement was predicated on making all three of those communities happy. That's a complicated process, but they managed to achieve it. So frequently, when we talk about the Good Friday Agreement in the context of Brexit, the implication is sort of raised that it's the job of the Good Friday Agreement to make the nationalists happy. No, it's the job of the Good Friday Agreement to keep everyone, including the unionists, happy. Because the Good Friday Agreement was predicated on the idea that all three of these communities aren't satisfied, there won't be peace in Northern Ireland. So the complication in the area of Brexit comes that unionists in Northern Ireland don't want any barriers between Northern Ireland and the remainder of the UK, because that implies that in some sense, Northern Ireland isn't a part of the United Kingdom. Nationalists don't want any barriers between Northern Ireland and Ireland, because that cuts across their vision of a united Ireland. The European Union offered a kind of a sort of a jam that you spread across the sandwich. And it allowed free trade and a good deal more between Ireland and Northern Ireland, because they're both in the European Union. And of course, it allowed free trade between, or mostly free trade, between Northern Ireland and the remainder of the UK proper. So that's easy to say. How do you square that circle of preserving all of those things when you remove the jam of the EU that allowed all of that free movement? Well, the answer that the UK and the EU have arrived at is that it's never been entirely true that there's been completely free movement between the UK proper and Northern Ireland. Ireland has always been treated as one agricultural area, one unified island, for reasons of sort of animal health, phytosanitary regulation, disease prevention, because people recognize that if, let's say, foot and mouth got into Northern Ireland, there's no practical barrier to stop it from spreading into Ireland proper. So the answer that the UK and the EU have arrived at is that there are not going to be any border checks between Northern Ireland and Ireland proper. There will be, just as there have been in the past, agricultural phytosanitary checks between Ireland and Northern Ireland. And the British have occupied a lot of their time over the last 9 months in drawing up a very carefully defined list of the goods that will need to be controlled between the UK proper and Northern Ireland. And this is one area where COVID has actually, I hate to say it, been an enormous blessing for the process of these negotiations, because the amount of consultation, now that everyone has accepted online meetings, the amount of consultation the British government has been able to do with businesses in Northern Ireland is at least tenfold compared to what they would have been able to do if everyone had to meet physically. When I talk to British government representatives who've been involved in this process, they say it's the most thorough and most exhausting consultation they've ever done, and it wouldn't have happened without Zoom or Teams or whatever it is that they're using. So it's an ill wind that blows absolutely no good. At the end of the day, this is not an absolutely perfect solution. I suspect that the more extreme unionists in Northern Ireland probably won't be delighted with it, but it's almost a continuation of the status quo. And I suspect that pretty much everyone will find it tolerable enough to deal with. It's a pretty pragmatic way of dealing with the problem.
So it looks like Northern Ireland may have a solution while the UK itself may not have a solution. So interesting turn of events there. So
yeah, and it's just in closing, it's important to remember that the Irish answer doesn't connect directly to the current ongoing EU-UK negotiations. There are some links between them about things like tariffs, but even if the UK and the EU have no deal, the UK EU deal on Ireland, Northern Ireland remains.
yeah.
So those are, they're all part of the same UK EU basket, but there are two parts to the basket.
Right, very interesting. Dalibor, would you like to add anything on top of that or give a perspective?
I mean, I broadly agree with Ted's assessment. It's a very tricky question, obviously, because there is this commitment to keep the border in Northern Ireland a soft one. Yet, if the UK is to leave the EU and retake control, then it might be also the external border of the EU. So the original idea in the deal negotiated between Theresa May and the EU involves keeping the entire UK in the customs union and Northern Ireland within some shape or form of the single market, absent alternative arrangements under sort of no deal scenario. That idea was scrapped, and the way it was renegotiated under the Boris Johnson government, it involves actually essentially drawing the border in a way through the Irish Sea in a not totally inobtrusive way, but in a way that would try to satisfy different constituencies. So Northern Irish authorities, for example, would collect customs duties on the EU's behalf on goods that would be coming into Northern Ireland from the rest of the UK. I mean, it's a tricky problem. You have to sort of draw the border somewhere, and I think illustrates this claim that there are trade-offs indeed involved in all of this, and the process of extricating the UK from the EU is a particularly tricky subject, because traditionally, when we think about free trade agreements involve bearing down trade barriers, bringing them down, getting countries to agree on either getting rid of tariff barriers or bringing their regulatory systems closer together so that goods and services can flow more freely. In this particular case, the trade agreement that's being negotiated really involves erecting new trade barriers necessarily, right? Like, you're not starting from a situation where the UK and the EU would be two sort of economies that have had very little interaction together, right? Like, when the EU is negotiating with Australia, bringing down tariff barriers, agreeing on some compromises in regulatory policy. Here we are starting, with the UK being a de facto, the same entity as the EU in terms of regulation, etc. And sort of unpooling sovereignty, and you create divergent regulatory environments, and that involves trade barriers. And it's you can't really have it both ways, right? So like, the more sovereignty and control you want, the more barriers there will be. We can talk about the sort of economic costs of those barriers. That would be an interesting area. But that sort of basic mechanism, that basic mechanism is there. And so that's all I have to say on the sort of Northern Irish question.
But it is interesting. So reverting back to an old, the status quo in a way, yet change would be happening for the UK in general. Very interesting. So thank you for enlightening us about that. Last question, and I know we're actually over time and we want to get to member questions here. Could you actually just elaborate? We've talked mostly that the Brexit is about trade agreements, economics, and those trade agreements. I mean, we could go down in many different directions, but curious now, as we talk about those trade agreements, it's between the EU and the UK. Well, what happens on a global stage for the UK with the US? And I'd also throw in China as they are, because those are the two sort of key global trade markets out here. So Dalibor, why don't we start with you? And if we could keep these two short questions, so short answers, so we can then get to everybody else's answers. But I know there's just so much richness and appreciate that. So thank you.
I think it's worth noting that the sort of global environment has changed somewhat since the time of the referendum. The issue of China and the sort of Chinese threat to Western liberal democracies is very much in the forefront in a way that wasn't 4 or 5 years ago. And I think that's a reason in and by itself for Western liberal democracies, the EU, United States, Canada, UK, to work closely together. And I think that should lead people to revisit and sort of think more carefully about the economic and regulatory ties that tie Western liberal democracies together. So, before the referendum, there was this sort of semi-fantasy out there that the UK would strike very quickly a trade deal with the United States and maybe use that as a source of leverage in the negotiations with the EU. I think with the Biden presidency, the likelihood of that actually happening is pretty slim. First of all, the president-elect doesn't seem to be keen on trade agreements generally, right? In his platform, there are all sorts of caveats to new trade negotiations. And I think, to the extent to which we can expect a return to pre-2016 situation, the Democratic administration will say, well, we care more about multilateral trade deals than about bilateral trade deals with countries like the UK, which is what Barack Obama, I think, said on one of his trips to London before the referendum. But given the changing situation, I think, and also the fact that any prospective negotiations between the US and the UK, on the one hand, and the withdrawal of the UK from the EU are essentially tied, right? Like the more commitments you make as the UK to the EU, the more it limits your maneuvering space with regard to what you can promise other parties. I think there is a case to be made, especially on technology questions, on questions of 5G, internet, and those sorts of things, for these three parties to work as closely together as possible. Actually, the European Commission released 2 weeks ago a sort of white paper outlining its philosophy in terms of approaching the next administration, dealing with questions of technology and regulation, trying to address some of these sore points in the transatlantic relationship in terms of EU regulatory approach to US tech giants. Recognizing that there is this emerging challenge from China, I think strengthens the case for having the same set of rules on both sides of the Atlantic in very broad strokes when it comes to technology. So I very much hope that will be the path that will be taken, and there already are indications.
Fairness, what an interesting concept on a global basis. That's fantastic. So I'm going to throw that same question over to you, Ted, and thank you, Dalibor, for your insights. And then add in Africa. Does Africa and that trade region actually have any impact?
Yeah, let me sort of go through very quickly regions of the world. I agree with Dalibor that the global situation has changed since 2016. I disagree profoundly that sort of identical rules on both sides of the Atlantic are a desirable way to approach the Chinese problem, but I think we're agreed that there is a China problem. The UK has moved quite rapidly and quite successfully to negotiate what are basically continuity agreements with a lot of trading partners around the world that essentially replicate the trade access that it got through the EU. Just in the last few days, there have been Canadian agreements, Singapore agreements. There have been quite a large number of other continuity agreements. The UK has signed its first FTA, departing from the EU arrangements with Japan, which it did a couple of months ago. Most interestingly, the UK is quite likely to join the revised TPP, the Trans-Pacific Trade and Investment Partnership that President Trump so unwisely pulled us out of back in 2017. I'm a little bit more optimistic about a US FTA than Dalibor is, though I think it is quite likely that the Biden administration is going to take a pause of 6 months to a year or so before they do much of anything on any of these fronts. But I would simply say that if there is not a UK-US FTA on a bilateral basis, the US is very likely at some point to come back to this Pacific trade deal that it walked out of about 4 years ago. And when it does come back to it, it's quite likely to find that the UK is already a member. And so if there's not a US-UK FTA through the front door, through the Atlantic, it's quite likely there will be one through the back door of the Pacific. One way or another, there is going to be an FTA between the US and the UK. It just depends on, the political modalities in the United States, what forum it happens to take place in, and those are pretty contingent developments. But one way or another, it's going to end up happening. The UK and the US are simply too big to plausibly ignore each other as FTA partners for all time to come. The question of Africa is interesting. Very briefly, the UK was the country that invented free trade in food in 1846 with the Anti-Corn Law League. I could go on about Victorian political history for a long time, but I won't. There is no logic whatsoever in the UK trying to be a major food producer. It is a very small and quite heavily populated island. It is a natural food importer and has been for 200 years. That food will come from a lot of places: US, Argentina, Australia, New Zealand, Europe, but it should also come from Africa. And one of the malign effects of the European Union in the agricultural field has been to tend to subsidize, at least over the course of the EU's history, European agricultural production at the expense of agricultural imports from the rest of the world. Now, I don't want to consign Africa to being the growers of food and the hewers of wood for Britain for all eternity, because that's not an attractive economic position to be in. But it is the case that an independent Britain should, if they are logical and reasonable, and I hope they will be, end up importing more food from places, including Africa, than Britain currently does.
Thank you. Interesting points, because in a way, what you're thinking about here with Africa, the Chinese have understood the bounty of that continent and the abundance of food that can be produced there, and the geographical proximity of the UK is much more aligned with that to take advantage of that, and they may not have. So interesting points. And it sounds like global trade agreements, somehow everything is still up in the air, but these things will all need to be solved, and they're all critical and could be solved in a variety of ways, but they're waiting to see each of those go out. But so gentlemen, we have had so much input from you already. I wanted to give the audience a chance to answer some of their questions, because it sounds like we could actually have part 2 and part 3 of this discussion and not even get to some of the key points and the depth that you both understand. So if it's okay, I'm going to now go into the Q&A and start to get some of our members' questions asked on there. Let's see what I can do here. So make sure that we are not covering some of the same questions. What do you, oh, here's one, the first question is, to what extent will be the damage done by Brexit to the UK's global diplomatic reputation and the ability to project power and influence and lead events? Who would like to take that? I would like to.
I'll take that, and Dalibor will probably want to weigh in as well. There are swings and roundabouts here. On the one hand, the UK will lose its input into EU things, and that covers an enormous range from EU rulemaking to EU trade policy, where the UK has been a significant driver of UK trade policy, to the quite limited extent that the EU has a foreign policy. There will be no UK influence there. So there is a diminution of influence that's hard to measure, and which is wildly variable across different policy areas. On the other hand, the UK is a member of NATO. The UK has a UN Security Council seat. The UK is almost the only European government that is trying to increase defense spending currently, which deserves praise. The UK is a G7 economy. It's a small island, but it's not a small economy. The UK entering into the world as an independent trading nation is a once-in-a-lifetime event as far as trade negotiations go. And then there are things, I hate the phrase soft power, because soft power is like the wind. You only feel it when it's moving, and it's really hard to control. But I'll just take the phrase soft power. The UK has a lot of it. It doesn't mean that it's easily mobilized or that the government can just sort of reach out and do things with it. But it is there, and it's a factor, and it's not going to be diminished by leaving the EU, because that soft power, if you had to sum it up in a couple words, I think relates mostly to the English language, although it's a lot more complicated than that. So swings and roundabouts, but at the end of the day, British influence around the world depends fundamentally on mostly factors that have nothing to do with the European Union.
Terrific. Dalibor, do you have anything else you want to add to that?
I think the sort of like basic contours of not the dilemma, but the sort of question that arises, I think they articulated those quite well. I have to say I changed my mind on this a little bit since the referendum. I was very skeptical of the prospect of the UK's becoming more influential or doing more in terms of foreign policy, partly as a result of the fact that British political elites would be distracted by Brexit itself, but also because, you know, the sort of idea of turning what is now the money laundering capital of Europe into a capital city that would be pushing for a sort of hawkish foreign policy agenda, for example, struck me as somewhat implausible. But I have to say that in terms of, for example, deploying sanctions, thinking in a sort of clear-eyed way about things like Chinese influence, forging security and intelligence cooperation with other countries, the UK exceeded my expectations on that front. There are downsides, obviously, to the UK's leaving the EU. I think one important factor is that because it was the third most influential member country by the share of its vote in the European Council, it could have had its influence on certain niche matters, on things that have to do with technology, for example, where the rest of the EU would let the UK sort of speak on behalf of the entire bloc. So that's partly gone, but I don't think that those ties, bearing some sort of really worst case, no deal, ugly divorce, I think those ties will still be in place. And France, for example, has taken a very pragmatic view of Brexit, right? Like at the same time as the EU has been playing really sort of hardball with with the UK. The defense cooperation, security cooperation has gone ahead unhindered by the Brexit talks, partly because it relies not on the EU but on the Lancaster House agreements. So much of that will go forward. I think there will be a question for the UK really to sort of go through and think about what its status in the world is going forward, whether it thinks of itself as always sort of mid-level power or more of a country like Denmark going forward. And I think that's very much a sort of debate to be had within the UK itself.
Terrific. Well, thanks. Thank you both, gentlemen. And we have a number of questions, and I'm going to put them into a couple of buckets. And let me just tell you what they are, and then maybe we can do sort of a fire and get both of your perspectives. So one of the areas is about Scotland and Wales. What happens to Scotland and Wales? Another area is the impact. What happens to the EU after this Brexit? Then the next bucket is London. London used to be the powerhouse of the financial market. Does that impact the EU's financial strength around the world? The next one is security issues. How does the security issues with China and Russia go in? And then the Commonwealth. What happens to the Commonwealth after all of this? So we've got those key issues. So why don't I start off with Scotland and Wales, and if we could do kind of quickly, because we have literally 8 minutes left, and I know that's interesting. So if we could start with that one really quickly, who would like to address the Scotland-Wales point?
I'll take it super quickly.
Yeah.
Wales, no significant effect. Wales and England are too closely tied. Scotland is on a long-term political trajectory which dates from the 1960s, that Brexit and EU issues may have aggravated but did not cause and doesn't even fundamentally shape. It's a much deeper and more serious issue than that.
Got it. Okay. And why don't we do this? We keep it to one person each, so we can do that. Let's do this. The impact of London and the financial markets. How does that what will London look like, and what does that necessarily do to the EU's financial clout on a global basis? So maybe Dalibor, I'll give that one to you.
Sure. Well, that depends really on the nature of the agreement that will be struck in financial services. I think many financial institutions are planning naturally for the no deal contingency. I know that Barclays moved 166 billion worth of assets to Dublin and set up, like they will have to set up subsidiaries in the single market to get around this prospect of no passporting. So if there isn't a sort of happy resolution to the financial service question, I mean, London will suffer somewhat, right? Like it is for many US and other companies around the world, the entry point into the single market. It's an English-speaking city. It enables you to operate all around Europe. So I think some of that will go away. It's not going to destroy the city altogether. There are many other things happening in the city of London that are not directly related to the UK's EU membership. As this is a process of erecting new trade barriers, it's a negative sum game. I think it would be a bit of a loss for London. It's going to be a loss for the EU as well. So that's about as much as I have to say on this.
Lisa, can I chime in very quickly on that?
Of course, please.
I spoke to the City of London Corporation about 10 days or so ago on this, and they are beyond relaxed about Brexit. All of their members have made their preparations. And I was astonished at how insouciant they were about this. Their members have moved staff to the extent that they've moved, to the extent they needed to move assets, they moved assets. I mean, all of these are multi-billion-dollar firms. they're not going to wait until December 31st to make preparations. They've made them already. They've factored a no deal into their calculations. They've been factoring it in for months, if not years at this point. I highly recommend an FT article of a couple of days ago, which did a Financial Times article of a couple of days ago, which did a comprehensive survey of the job outlook in the city of London, and found that there had been almost no job losses in the city due to Brexit. And to the extent there had been job losses, it was firms doing restructurings for individual firm reasons, not related to Brexit, stuff that probably would have happened anyhow. So I am extremely confident that the City of London is going to look just fine after Brexit is all done and dusted.
Terrific. Yeah, seems like everybody's moved. So we have 2 areas left and about 5 minutes left to do it. So I want to put both of these on the table. I think they're interesting. First is the security issue, Security Council. How does this EU and the Brexit have an impact on that? And then the Commonwealth, which we haven't really talked about through that. So I'm going to throw those 2 questions up in the air. And who'd like to take the security question first?
I think there is an imperative for the UK and the EU to work closely together going forward. This has to be really understood as an exercise in which, I mean, the UK is re-evaluating its position and its relationship with the EU, but it's not really like throwing everything out of the window, right? And I think the rationale for a strong transatlantic alliance, of which the UK is a part of, remains as compelling as before the referendum. And I think the British really are taking a very responsible position on this, as evidenced by the increases in defense spending, the boost to the Royal Navy, although it might be somewhat far-fetched to imagine the Royal Navy patrolling South China Sea and enforcing freedom of navigation there, but I am, as I said, more optimistic about the prospect of the UK playing a role in this area, and I think Europeans understand that themselves, right? It's one of the few real military powers in Europe, and they would do well to keep the Brits close when it comes to these matters.
Maybe I should take the Commonwealth question since Dalibor has taken the security question. The fundamental problem with the Commonwealth is that it is simply too big. It has too many members that are too diverse for it to arrive at any meaningful, commonly held positions, except in sort of very peripheral areas like a bit of legal cooperation and sort of shared legal training. But you're never going to get a Commonwealth trade agreement. You're never going to get a Commonwealth defense agreement or a security alliance or anything like that. These things were impractical in the days of Joseph Chamberlain 100 years and 120 years ago, and they're impractical today. So Commonwealth relations de facto post-Brexit are going to be sort of two-tier, which they already really are. The UK, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and some other places are going to have FTAs. The UK and places and a lot of other Commonwealth members may or may not have FTAs, depending on sort of the individual position, but there won't be some sort of collective Commonwealth action because, for better or for worse, that is just not a practical possibility within the Commonwealth structure.
You need to unmute yourself, Lisa.
Sorry, I was good about unmuting myself. Is it Dalibor, is there anything else you'd like to add on that on Commonwealth?
Yeah, I broadly agree. It's an organization that doesn't really have the same sort of alignment of interests and homogeneity that would make it like play a bigger role than it currently does. And I don't think Brexit really changes that very much.
Terrific. Well, gentlemen, I think we are right at our time. So this is absolutely amazing. What a wealth of information. So much has happened over the past year since this agreement to exit, as well as during the interim period of as they got to that point where they were making that decision. And it sounds like there's still many more things to iron out. But I think what we can look at here is that as we look at a world where Brexit is generally an economic issue, as well as a free movement issue. The world right now as it stands with COVID and Brexit, which one is sort of the broader perspective, which one is actually going to make a bigger impact? How are people going to be dealing with them? And it sounds like there's the resilience of people in the UK for every nation and every group that they work with. And I think that people always have some way of coming to a resolution, even though it's probably not what we all thought a priori. So this is very interesting, and we really appreciate your insights, and thank you all to all of our members for their questions. And I'm sorry if we didn't get to all of the questions, but if there's an opportunity, we might get some more questions and share some of that with you both, Ted and Dalibor, because your insights are invaluable. And I've learned so much today, so really appreciate that. So thank you both for your time and your insights, and thank you all members for your contributions and your questions. Just a little bit of housekeeping to close out the session. There's the last session, which is a members session for next week, where the ambassador of Ducerak, who is going to be giving her view on the UN, and that's on December 17th from 6 to 7 p.m. That'll be our last briefing of this amazing year, 2020. And we look forward to welcoming everybody again in 2021 and wish everybody the happiest of holidays, keeping safe and healthy, and keeping our minds open to constantly learning. So thank you, everyone. Really appreciate it.
Lisa, thank you.
Ciao.